Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of all ages, Coach Bryant here. Today, we are throwing it back to our episode we did with Mr. Andy Blow from Precision Hydration, where we talk about how to dial in your hydration strategy. Super important aspect is making sure you've got your hydration dialed in. So without further ado, let's jump into that episode.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Coaches on Couches.
Being slouches.
We got a good one today.
It's the headphone edition.
We're rocking the headphones because we've got Andy Blow from Precision Hydration, not literally on the couch. He was once on the couch.
He's been here before.
He's going to be virtually on the couch. I'm going to put him right here between us.
His smiling face.
I'm just going to put him right between us.
With his long lockdown locks.
With the lockdown locks. We're going to chat about hydration. We're going to get a little deeper today than the typical. We've had a couple of different episodes on hydration. Last few years, it's kind of been a big focus of ours, and that's been thanks to Andy and his crew as well. One thing we will drop before we bring Andy in, obviously it's getting hot. This weekend, specifically in the Mid-South, is supposed to be a toasty one. Humidity's coming back. It's going to be in the 90s, so it'll probably feel close to 100. So now is the time to get your hydration dialed in, and we will go into why a little bit more. But if you are interested in getting your sweat sodium concentration tested with us, obviously give us a shout. buildpeakcompete.com. You can actually book your test.
/hydration. You can find out details.
Yeah. And book your test, and we'll get you dialed in.
Yeah, we've, it started a few weeks ago. It was a hot, humid Saturday ride. And like right after that, reading comments on athletes was, man, I felt horrible.
Yeah, I think we said
cramps were coming, like all these indicators, and those people actually ended up booking hydration tests.
We said it last week, pretty much. Once we start seeing the heart rate threshold notifications come in, one after another, that's when we know it's getting nice and toasty in town.
So listen up. Andy's going to help get you all up to speed on the importance of hydration and how to really dial that in.
All right, so we're going to bring Andy in here
from across the pond.
From his shed, she shed?
It's my shed, yeah. I'm in the garden today.
There you go. Well, like we said before, we kind of want to get into a little more detailed hydration stuff, just mostly some specific questions that we continuously get asked during hydration tests and just from athletes in general. So, we know that sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration are kind of like the big pieces of the puzzle here. My first question to you is whiskey a good hydrator?
Well, based on my experiences of visiting you guys, it works for a while, and actually it seems to improve everything for a while, and you just get way better at stuff. And then all of a sudden it goes the other way.
Just like it's
like that bell curve, right? You got that bell curve where it's going up, and then suddenly.
Well, I tell you, it's a bit like my brother's a skateboarder. He does skateboarding and surfing and that kind of thing, and he's like adamant that 1 to 1.5 beers, for example, right, makes you a way better skateboarder. But then he says 2, 3 onwards, it's a big drop off.
Yeah,
that's
probably the same with whiskey and hydration.
Risk reward, really. All right, so we got the two pieces, sweat sodium concentration and sweat rate. So we know sweat rate is a big important thing, but why is sweat sodium concentration such an important metric to have?
I think the biggest reason understanding your sweat sodium concentration is important is because the range in different people is so huge. So this is all about individualization, because you could be on the far left of our bell curve with with someone who's got very dilute sweat, if you're only losing 200 milligrams of sodium in every litre that you sweat out, then it takes you, even with a high sweat rate, it's going to take you ages to work up a sodium deficit. In fact, you can go for hours and hours without doing so. If you flip to the other end of the curve, where you and I are, Dale, 2,000 milligrams or close to it, then you can be running a sodium deficit within a couple of hours if you're in the extreme heat and if you've got a high sweat rate. So it's a huge factor in determining what your hydration, electrolyte replacement needs are going to be, and gets compounded by your sweat rate. So you can't really have an intelligent conversation about one of those factors without bringing the other one in.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for us, personally, Brian and I both are can be in the heat of the summer, somewhere in the 2.5 to 3 liter an hour sweat rate. And then personally, I'm in that close to that 1,500 milligram per liter sweat sodium concentration. So, I mean, I've done 45-minute crits and been totally like on the ground, like dizzy, like feeling like garbage afterwards. And for the longest time, it was surprising. But then figuring out all this stuff, it became a little bit more, you just do the simple math, and you figure out that, man, you could be unloading a ton of sodium in a short amount of time.
And the thing about the environment you guys live in is that isn't just when you're actively exercising as well. That's just being outside and doing stuff. Because I know that we've spoken before about people that are working outdoors, and you'll have athletes who are doing busy jobs, manual jobs, or just on the go all day long in that kind of heat and humidity. The amount that you can sweat and the amount of salt you can lose just during an average day is pretty high. If you've got a high sodium concentration, then you compound that by going training in the evening, and it's easy to see how you can fall behind on that if you don't know what you're keeping up with.
Yeah. I think our low test is like what?
Three
upper threes, 375 maybe, something close to that. And then our highest test is like 1960 something. Yeah. So just picturing the range there as compared to the average person sweat rate in the summer here is, it could be 1 liter, it could be 3 liters. So a much, while it compounds, it's a much smaller range as compared to sweat sodium concentration.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's when you get, and it's when you get on that higher range of the sweat sodium plus the higher range of the sweat output when you really start to see the big numbers of loss. Because a lot of people, we're recommended to eat, depending on where you live, somewhere between like 2,500 and 4,000 milligrams of sodium a day normally, and that for you or I is gone in 2 hours of exercise quite comfortably.
Yeah, easily.
So we're on a totally different scale. And there's that whole thing about people's fear and aversion to sodium, which has been kind of like bred into us by health messaging around sodium is bad for you, it'll elevate your blood pressure. And that message, which is like actually really probably is quite applicable to a lot of people who are sedentary, don't do a lot of exercise, don't do a lot of sweating, is completely flipped on its head when it comes to athletes. And we've noticed increasingly an amount of athletes that come to us who've been having problems if they've been trying to eat really clean, and trying to be not eating enough sodium, and thinking that it's actually kind of, even if they feel a bit crappy when they're eating low sodium, they think it's maybe, I've got to adapt to this. This is just one of those things. I've got to adapt to this, so I'll keep it going. And actually, what you find is that those people, as soon as you put the salt back in the diet, when you put the electrolytes back in the sports drinks, it's like a switch is flicked. Yeah, and the performance goes back up again.
For sure. So let me ask you this. This is another question we get a lot. Does your sodium intake affect, between sodium intake and like just different conditions, does the sweat sodium concentration change over time or with, high and low sodium diets?
That is a brilliant question, because we get asked that one all the time as well. So it's not a quick answer, although the quick version of the answer is, for all practical purposes. We're going to need the quick answer. Yeah, I'll go for it. The quick answer is, for all practical purposes, your sweat sodium probably doesn't change much for you as an individual and certainly not enough to warrant, once you know it, for you to warrant major changes in what you might do about your hydration strategy or your sodium intake.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because the physiology behind it is pretty straightforward. Sweat comes from your blood plasma, and your blood plasma is very salty. So, and also every human that's upright and walking around, with almost no exceptions, their blood plasma sodium is the same because it's regulated. It's very, very tightly controlled. So we know that the pool of plasma that sweat's drawn from has about 3,600 milligrams of sodium per litre in it. It's a very salty liquid. That liquid moves into the sweat glands, goes out into the skin, and then evaporates. But as part of that process, the sweat glands are clever, and the body's clever because it wants to conserve sodium, so it reabsorbs some of it. And the amount that it reabsorbs has a huge genetic component. So that's what drives the major difference between, say, you and I and this person that you've tested who's losing a tiny bit of sodium in their sweat, is that they've just got sweat glands that work phenomenally well to reclaim that sodium. So when we do a sweat test, what we're kind of figuring out is how well do your sweat glands work at reabsorbing salt. And that's fairly fixed. Now, the exceptions to that come when you get into really extreme scenarios. So there has been research done, a lot of it back in the 30s and 40s, where they sodium deprived people. So it's really hard to deprive people of sodium if you let them live in the free world and have access to normal food. So what they did was locked a bunch of people in this house voluntarily, made them sweat a lot. So they put them in hot baths and saunas and got them to sweat loads of salt out. They fed them food that was like boiled 3 times and washed to get rid of all the sodium in it, which sounds like a horrendous diet. Yeah. They gave them as much water as they wanted to drink. And then they sort of did a load of measurements. And what they found was really interesting. Your body knows that it needs a lot of salt. So as soon as you stop putting salt in, what your body does is cuts off salt loss. And it does that primarily with the kidneys and your urine. So they were measuring how much salt was in their urine, how much sodium they were peeing out. And within a few hours of stopping eating salt, that dropped. And within a day or so, I think it dropped to 0 or close to 0. So your kidneys switch on and go, right, we're going to reclaim all this sodium, keep it in the body. We're not going to pee any out. Then a few days later, they were measuring sweat during this time. And at first, you just keep sweating out salt. You keep sweating out salt. But eventually, you get to a point where the body is like desperate times, desperate measures, and it starts to cut down the amount of sodium that you lose in your sweat. So your sweat does become more dilute. But interestingly, by that point, these people are ill. They're fatigued and weak. They're cramping. They can hardly get out of bed. You read the descriptions in the papers that were written. It sounds horrendous.
Sounds like torture.
Yeah. And also because of the extreme lengths they had to go to lower that sweat sodium by reducing salt in their diet. That's not something which we would typically find normal people would do. Yeah. Because A, it's really hard to, because you have to be so careful about what you eat not to get any sodium.
Yeah.
And B, like who's going to do that when they're training and performing? It's just not a realistic scenario. So interestingly, what they found was as soon as they reintroduced sodium into the diet, then they worked out what that kind of deficit was, how much sodium they reckon they'd lost. And then it wasn't until the people had consumed all of that sodium back that they started to see sodium coming back into the urine and back into the sweat. So when the body had it's so finely tuned to what levels you've got and what it needs, it's effectively tops itself back up, and then the process of elimination starts all over again.
Hey, body's smart.
Yeah,
body knows what it's doing.
Exactly. Yeah,
it's incredibly smart, and that's why we say to people, the game here with hydration, with sodium fluid replacement, isn't to know all these exact figures and numbers. You don't need to, because your body's doing the hard yards. You need to get it roughly right, and the way to get it roughly right is understand what you're putting out, have an understanding and appreciation of what you can realistically absorb and what's compatible with performance and the logistics of the race. You can often, for example, drink quite a bit more in a bike race than you can in an ultra marathon, just because of the way it's set up, what you've got to carry and stuff. Yeah. But you just need to get those ballpark figures and then get it close. If you get it close, the body will be totally fine. It's when people are when the needle is way in the wrong direction that they suffer the adverse consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, because even when we do, well, let's just put it this way. Endurance athletes are inherently like analytical and want to know exactly. We don't want a ballpark number. I want to know exactly what I need to do.
And if a little's good, a lot is a whole lot better.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So we get that all the time. Like, well, just tell me exactly what I need to. We're giving we give them tested, and they do a sweat rate test, and we have this like fantastic ballpark. And well, here's where we need to start. Go out and do it. If you're not having a problem, we're good. Go with it.
Exactly.
But they want to know like so much detail, and it's just like you said, your body will do the hard work as long as you get close.
Yeah, and to Brian's point, about the kind of, oh well, I'll take a load of that or whatever. The typical response we see sometimes is people go along fine, have a little problem, have a big problem, and then everything's got to change because they've had this big problem. And it's like, if it was a hydration problem, I'm going to change everything. I'm going to triple the amount of sodium I'm taking. I'm going to triple the amount of water that I'm drinking, or halve it. Or it's, instead of the game being actually a lot more subtle than that. And it's being more subtle is painful because it means being more painstaking. It means getting yourself a little spreadsheet out and recording, okay, I drank this and I took this much sodium and this is how I felt. And then doing it again and again, and just moving the dial a little bit. And as you've said, getting in that ballpark, that's what the testing's for. Basically the testing gets you to that point where we can get you with the testing and a hydration plan, we can get you 9/10 of the way there. And that final 10th is that tweaking process.
Yeah. I think that was kind of the biggest surprise, I guess you'd say, for me. Like when I first got into endurance sports, you have your Gatorades and your Powerades that are like so popular, so mainstream.
Yeah.
And you just assume, okay, that's a sports drink. I'm getting what I need from that. But really the variety of needs and why we can't just tell one person like, hey, this is exactly what you should be drinking without, or not even exactly, but without actually going and finding out, well, what is your sweat sodium concentration and how much are you sweating out? And even your needs over the course of a single workout session can be vastly different depending on external conditions. So there's just a lot of factors in there. But doing a sweat sodium concentration test is huge in helping a person really get much closer to what they need to be doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we, it could be down to the, are you doing short course races? Are you there's a lot of other factors that are involved here, rather than just, hey, tell me what to drink. It just doesn't really work like that.
But you'll know this from coaching, and I know you guys have got a good amount of expertise in bike fitting and that kind of thing as well. When you stand on the outside and look in, and you don't really know the complexities of a task like that. Everyone wants the kind of the Cliff Notes version, the quick, hydration for dummies or whatever. And it's not until you actually get into it, study it, play around with it, tweak it, and actually genuinely understand it that you get that actual useful knowledge.
Yeah.
And a lot of elite athletes or experienced athletes gain that knowledge, maybe even without realizing it, just over years and years and years, because elite athletes are, as well as being genetically talented and everything else, they tend to be the people that do things a little bit better. They do things iteratively. They measure stuff. They repeat things and they learn from it. And they do this intuitively. What the testing does in this case is it enables you to kind of skip out some of the wider ranging testing and get it into that narrow zone, so that you don't have to rely on 10 years of experience to get it right.
Yeah, it really is the easy button for the most part.
Oh, for
so
sure.
So you met a little while ago, you mentioned absorption. And so around here, with people easily sweating 2.5-3 liters an hour in the thick of the summer, talk a little bit about that tipping point where you can't physically intake the fluid that you're losing. And does that mean that we need to tweak how much sodium or electrolyte is in your fluids?
Yeah, as you've mentioned, if you're so sweat, you can easily sweat to 2.5-3 liters an hour if you're going hard in the heat, and yet your gastric emptying rate, your absorption rate in the gut, probably for most people isn't going to exceed 1, maybe pushing 1.5 liters an hour. And I've very rarely seen anyone who can comfortably drink that amount. Generally, we would say to people the ceiling is close to 1 liter an hour for the average person. And that's partly because when you exercise, you get less blood flow than you normally get to your gut. So you're trying to absorb into kind of a stressful situation because you obviously need the blood flow there to pull the fluid across, and you're not getting it because it's going elsewhere. So you're always in this losing battle situation. So in the heat, first thing is always start well hydrated. And that doesn't mean drinking tons and tons of water before you go. That means, high levels of electrolytes to pull extra water into your bloodstream in the hour before you go to make sure that you're topped up. And then, honestly, in those kind of hot weather conditions and extreme humidity, high sweat rates, it becomes that battle almost of like, how much can you comfortably get in and absorb, and how long can you sustain that deficit? And what we found tends to work with some people if their losses are extremely high, as you alluded to, is maybe a little bit more sodium in the fluid, because that enables the body to, that creates the osmotic drive for it to go. The sodium moves into the bloodstream and pulls fluid with it and holds it there, rather than just constantly diluting yourself. And, there is always this point. I've worked with a few elite athletes now, particularly guys preparing for Kona, who have off the chart sweat rates. And you kind of get to this point where, without being defeatist, it just becomes a competitive disadvantage for them.
Sure.
There's a disadvantage. I remember when we did a seminar with your team a few years ago, there's a lady spoke to us about a low sweat rate and how she couldn't sweat enough and was finding it hard to cool. And that can be a problem. If your sweat rate's really low, you can suffer in the heat because you don't cool enough. So the body tends to sweat more when we go exercise in the heat. But up to a certain point, that's good. Beyond a certain point, you are again just like chucking fluid and sodium out and not getting it back. So as you get into those upper echelons, if you're that kind of person who knows that on a hot day you're already having to drink 2 or 3 bottles an hour, then you're probably, the next place you want to go looking is a bit more sodium in those fluids rather than more fluid, because that'll hopefully help get it into your system a bit easier.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the big thing you stated there, and a mistake so many people make, was on the front end, where people think, it's going to be a hot day, I'm going to need a lot of fluids, and you go to the kitchen sink and just chug a bunch of water. But that's a problem in and of itself. So make sure you heard him clearly when he said you want to be taking in those electrolytes in that preload process.
I would always say, and don't be afraid, the night before you go on a big ride or a big run at the weekend, Friday night, a bit of extra salt on your food, that kind of thing definitely doesn't do a lot of harm. If you know you're going to go out and sweat for 4 or 5 hours, then that's kind of an insurance policy. We just reviewed a paper that was published in 2019 that looked at the blood sodium levels in ultra runners doing the Spartathon in Greece, which is about 150 miles, I think, in very hot conditions. And like 10% of the starters there turned up and had their blood drawn on the line at the start and were already hypernatremic, so they were low on sodium. Wow. Now, the only plausible explanation in my head for that is that they've just been, because they know it's going to be a long hot race, is they've been smashing water for 2 days.
Yeah.
And because I'm pretty sure if you went out on the street and took the blood sodium levels of a bunch of people, you're not going to find 10% of them are walking around hypernatremic. Yeah. But you tell athletes prepare, hydrate, and you're risking that overcompensation thing.
Yeah, they automatically assume it's like hydration and water. It's like they only put those two together when for myself, like I have to have, like I preload with at least 1 liter prior to a race, and have to have it, and it's all got, and that's 1,500 milligrams of sodium before you even get going, And I
believe the recommendation was also Mexican food. I think I heard that in there.
Yeah,
with the extra sodium
chips
on your
and
food.
Salsa.
Yeah.
prior to race. But yeah, if you don't like, if you're just smashing in water, you're just diluting. And then again, if you reduce sodium in your food, all that kind of stuff, I mean, it's just, you know, if you're a high sweat sodium concentration person, you're asking for issues.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Been there, done that. So, yeah. So let me ask you this. Like you're talking about adding sodium and preloading and stuff like that, just to kind of reiterate, it is very hard to overdo sodium as an endurance athlete, like doing lots of exercise. Like how hard is it actually to get hypernatremic?
To get hypernatremic is pretty tough. That's not a challenge, because endurance athletes, you know, they love a challenge. And like to Brian's comment earlier about, you know, people who do 10x, you know, whatever you tell them to do or whatever. I would always caveat that with like, look, let's not say it's impossible to go there and do too much, but it's
not a challenge.
It is a little bit harder because your kidneys are very, very adept at flushing extra sodium out. So if you eat, that's what I was talking about earlier with the early studies, you know, they measure sodium output in your urine when they do a study on how much sodium you're eating, because any excess is pretty quickly got rid of. As long as you've got healthy kidneys, then you'll pump it out. So hypernatremia, like there was a famous case of a guy who drank a quart of soy sauce for a bet, and soy sauce it's very, very salty. You know, like I think it's like 3 or 4 times saltier than seawater. It's got
which is like 35 grams per liter.
Yes,
seawater.
Yeah, and it's way saltier than that. So this guy like chugs this quart of soy sauce, feels a bit unwell, goes into a coma, into hospital, and fortunately they figure out what's going on and pump a load of, I think they just pumped effectively a very, you know, like water or you know, they diluted his blood back down again. Because what happens when you hypernatremia obviously is high blood sodium levels, and then what you get is you get a rush of water from the intracellular space in the body into the bloodstream to try and dilute that down. So you get all the cells in the body just like shrinking, shriveling, getting damaged. It's just catastrophe. And he was lucky that he got away with it. But unless you're going to do something as crazy as that, like severely overdoing the sodium is a bit more tricky, because your body's got quite an aversion to it. So we've all done that thing at the Mexican restaurant where you kind of reach the point where you've had enough salt, you know, because the chips, maybe not for Brian, but the chips just don't taste as good anymore. And that's the first line of defense, because your body, you know, when you go in there and you are a little bit salt depleted, chips are the best tasting thing in the world. And then you have a handful of them and you have a bit more, and sooner or later it does, you know, that even if you don't get an aversion to it, the enjoyment factor diminishes rapidly. So overdoing the sodium is trickier because of that. But also, like I say, as long as your kidneys are working healthy, and this isn't an incitement to just go hard with the sodium, but if you have a little bit more in the build up to a race, I would always suggest that's probably more prudent than having a little bit less.
Yeah. So like I get this all the time with people that they say that they feel swollen, and then they equate that somehow to having too much sodium. I don't know where this came from, but you want to squash that?
Well, I can partly squash it. I think though there are cases where we've seen a few athletes. So we saw a very good case of an athlete who was a low sodium guy, like 250, 300 milligrams a litre, and a relatively low sweat rate. And this guy was a pro Grand Tour cyclist, you know, who's in the Vuelta a España one year, very hot year, and his team sort of think this is hot. They start putting way more sodium in the drinks for everyone, and he did start to get. So he gained weight in the first week of the Vuelta, and that was sodium related fluid retention, because he's like drinking a lot, and they took him off the drink. They figured it out, you know, take him off the drinks, his weight starts to normalize. So it can happen. You know, you can get that. But often with endurance exercise and fluid retention and stuff, quite often there's a big implication for things like kidney damage, because when you do really hard, long endurance exercise, you get a load of proteins released into the bloodstream, from damaged muscle fibers, stuff. You gum up your kidneys. You aren't able to, they're not able to process fluid as well. And that's often where people can get swelling. And that can be made worse by, perversely by dehydration, even though you're gaining fluid, but you're not gaining fluid in the right places. So you're kind of becoming dehydrated, but you've got extracellular fluid buildup. So I think feeling puffy like that is a sign that something's out of whack. And then you need to go back and look at, okay, what have I been doing that's created that? It could be like not enough sodium, but it could also be way too much sodium. Yeah. It's definitely a sign that you're not in the right zone.
So we've to some extent too, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it could be like heat edema, where the sun exposure is creating, kind of a swelling.
Absolutely. You get that, especially when you're in the early phase of adaptation to the heat. So if you go somewhere hot, or if for you guys, you've had a mild phase and then all of a sudden, bang, the temperature needle goes up one weekend, everyone's falling apart because, you haven't had time to acclimate, then that can definitely occur. I think the main thing with it is, one thing I find it really useful for athletes to do, and not enough people do this, is getting regular tabs on your morning weight, your morning body weight, because I understand why some athletes don't want to, especially if they are conscious about their weight, they don't want to be weighing themselves all the time. But at the same time, having that metric on whether your weight's kind of bouncing around quite a lot, if there's obviously it trends up if you're gaining weight, and it trends down over time if you're losing weight. But on a day-to-day basis, any significant variation from one day to the next is largely often fluid deficit or gain. And I think if you're getting swollen and puffy and that kind of thing, and seeing large spikes in weight gain and that sort of thing, that could be a sign that it's to do with sodium and fluid intake as opposed to other factors. And so that can be a useful exercise to go through if you've got people who are seeing that on a regular basis.
Gotcha. Well, let me ask you this. I've been wanting to ask this question for a while. This is a personal question. Yeah, I'm sure other people go through this, and I've mentioned it to you before, but I'm pretty diligent about hydration, and yet I will still wake up in the morning feeling hungover and peeing a dark color, even though I drank plenty of fluids the night before.
Sounds like this relates back to that whiskey question.
Even though he haven't let me finish. Even though I haven't touched any alcohol the day prior. What's up with that?
Good question. The honest answer is you're not going to suddenly dehydrate overnight. If you go to bed reasonably well hydrated, then you are not going to, unless your aircon's broken and it's 95 and 90% humidity, you're not gonna have that. There's nothing that's going to cause you to lose a ton of fluid overnight, because we got asked that question a while ago, and Abby, our sports scientist, did a bit of reading into it to kind of think, well, actually, is there anything that could go on here? So the chances are that what is actually happening there is there's a bit of accumulated dehydration during the day. You're drinking, you are drinking a lot and trying to keep up. But if for example, you're becoming, because you've got lots of fluid in the body, you've got intracellular fluid where most of your fluid stores are, and then you've got extracellular fluid, your bloodstream and all the rest of it. When you drink, you top up your extracellular system initially because it goes into your bloodstream. Now, if you're not, then overnight, I think what tends to happen is your body recalibrates, and it's probably taking extracellular fluid and topping up the intracellular fluid reservoir and stores, and therefore you could then wake up in the morning and you're your body's trying to conserve fluid because you are, from an extracellular perspective, a little bit more dehydrated. And so that would still be a sign probably of inadequate fluid and sodium intake the previous day. So that would be the number one thing to look at. You're not buying that one though.
No, honest, that's more or less what I've equated it to. But it's like you get to the end of the day and you're taking in plenty of fluids. So it's gotten to the point where I'm like, I'm not thirsty anymore and I don't want to drink anymore. And then it just, you go to bed and things shift, fluid shifts between the blood and cells. And then you end up waking up in the morning super thirsty and, slightly.
So a really interesting way to check that would be to weigh yourself before you go to bed and in the morning, and obviously see, because if that weight is approximately the same, but you're feeling hydrated when you go to sleep and dehydrated when you wake up, the chances are that is probably predominantly fluid shift because you haven't got a net fluid loss. So that would be an interesting experiment to do a few times, I reckon.
I could do it. I'm going to do it.
Make it happen.
I'm going to do it.
And maybe stop sleeping with that weighted blanket.
Yeah, we won't go there. It's not my choice. So let's go here. So just so we can at least have some kind of actionable stuff for people. If you had to, I know we're talking about everything's very individualized, but if you had to give the majority a starting point based on tests and all the stuff you guys are doing, where would that be?
So for fluid volume, I would say for endurance athletes, if we talk real averages, which are horrible things because, we deviate a long way from the averages, but just to give people who have no idea, like a calibration on the numbers, I would say if you're exercising for multiple hours, especially if it's warm or hot, because that's what people are interested in. No one's too bothered about hydration plans for the cold. It's about when it gets warmer or hotter. Yeah. If you're drinking less than about 500 mils or 16 ounces per hour, that for me is on the lower end of where anyone should be most of the time, because we know that the average kind of adult sweat rate in warm conditions when you're doing aerobic endurance stuff is close to a litre an hour, and it can be well north of that. So something around that 16 ounces, 500 mils an hour is the lower end of what most people should start experimenting at. And that's if you think you're a low sweater, if it's not too hot, all that kind of thing. Going to the other end for fluid volume, if you're very, very hot, if you're a very sweaty person who thinks that dehydration is holding you back, then I would start experimenting with somewhere around 32 ounces or a litre per hour. And then for everyone else, it's kind of between those two markers. So it's a fairly narrow range. You probably don't want to be much less than 16 ounces an hour, but you don't want to be vastly more than 32 ounces an hour for the majority of the time. So I'd say low start there, high start there. And then with sodium, a low amount of sodium to take per hour, especially if you're doing only a few hours or low amount of hours of activity, is anything close to, anything down as far as zero, basically. There'll be plenty of people who can get through a couple of hours, 3 hours with zero intake. Now, whether that's optimal for their recovery afterwards is another question, but not everyone needs to take a ton of sodium when they're exercising. If we go right to the other end and go, what's someone who loses a ton of sodium going to need to take per hour? Very few athletes that I find need to take more than 1,500 milligrams per hour. So if you're already up at that end or close to it, then, and you're still having problems, going looking for the solution to those problems with more sodium is probably not a great idea. You've probably got to look elsewhere. So that kind of gives you that bandwidth. And I would say, for that average athlete, long distance endurance stuff in the heat, 700, 800, 900 milligrams of sodium an hour is a good target to start playing around with. If you've got no, crampers, people with very high sweat rates, go north of that. People with lighter sweat losses or people who just don't have perceived problems in the heat, you can go south of that. Yeah.
And I know you don't like throwing other companies under the bus, but I'll do it. In the sense of the sodium concentration of something like Brian brought up, water would be zero for the most part, trace amounts. And then, something like a typical off-the-shelf, ready-to-drink Gatorade, Powerade, all that kind of stuff, you're talking like 500 milligrams per liter tops. I mean, some of the endurance formulas are just slightly higher, but
I think endurance gives you like 700 or so, 700 milligrams an hour, a litre, something like that.
But most of the stuff in the store is somewhere, I think it's between 420 and 500 per liter, which in our experience in this area, the athletes we've tested is vastly lower than the average.
Definitely, yeah. Average would be like 900 to 1,000. It's a bit like having your whiskey at like 20% alcohol.
I don't know what that's
That's
like.
called a wine cooler.
That's called a spritzer. So we're like, a ton of people have been in lockdown. People are still a little bit hesitant to do. We're opening up maybe a little bit more than you guys are, and we may be going backwards here in a second. But people are training indoors way more than they have been. So, we've talked about it a little bit in a sense of just saying, hey, it can be just as hot and humid in your pain cave as it can outside in the summer. So just reiterate some of the tips that you have for people who are training, especially multiple hours indoor or doing VR racing or anything like that. So what have you guys been putting out on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, because indoor training, if you go like for like on temperature and humidity and stuff, indoor training is obviously way worse for sweat loss because you haven't got the airflow, even with a really good set with fans. I think tip number one is get loads of fans, because you're only going to, I talked to the guys who run the platform Trainer Road, the online thing there. And they almost like talk about, they've got all these high powered fans and things. And it's almost like a kind of indoor training doping if you get the fans right, because you can keep your core body temperature down. The wattage outputs go up, the heart rates come down. You can see it in the physiological metrics. Basically, really powerful fans reduce the cardiovascular strain of training indoors, which means that if you've not already got that, if you take that away, then 200 watts. I sat on the bike at 220 watts this morning without the fan on in here, and you just see your heart rate drifting after a while, because and the sweat's pouring. So for any unit of time, plus the relentlessness of the trainer in that you don't get the coasting, the freewheeling, the change in pace, I think those two factors mean that expect to sweat quite a bit more per hour than you would outdoors. And therefore, but the good thing is you're indoors, so you can have your full, you can hydrate to your heart's content. You can have it all set up and make sure that you're keeping on top of it. Because I got through a session there this morning quite easily just by drinking the thirst, because it was a short session. But if I was on there for 2-3 hours and then want to go out and do a training session in the evening or something, you've got to make sure that you're drinking more than you need to get through that individual session, if that makes sense. Otherwise, the deficit you build up training indoors is massive.
Yeah. Oh, I've definitely came close to dropping out after a trainer session just because I didn't drink. I thought I drank enough, but you think, oh, I'm indoors, I'm not being exposed to the sun. You think it's not as hot.
The thermostat,
set at your house is set at 74. Whatever. So it's supposed to be that temperature inside, and that's pleasant. Yeah, and then so I don't need as many electrolytes, and I'll just drink one bottle of water, and then I'll go to electrolytes, and then 2 hours in on a turbo session, and you're getting off like almost falling to the ground.
Well, the big clue is that the sweat. What does the sweat do? When you're indoors, you see it drips off. And when sweat drips off, it doesn't take any heat with it. Whereas when you're outdoors, you get that constant movement of air, which is what's causing that evaporative effect, which is taking the heat away. So, and to your point there, intervals and stuff indoors are obviously what people do a lot of the time, which then jack up your heat production a lot more, which is then going to increase you. Because I would say 9 out of 10 people ride a shitload harder on that thing than you do outdoors for the unit of time. So all of the factors conspire to make it hotter and sweatier, basically.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the last topic we wanted to get into is we get this quite a bit, because when we do tests, we're going over hydration strategies, and none of them include calories in the bottle. And so then we get the follow-up question, well, if I'm only drinking electrolytes and fluid, where am I going to get my calories from? How am I going to get calories and fluid and electrolytes, balance it all out, and still, keep energy up and stay hydrated.
So we've been working on this question a lot, because for the same reason as you, we started out hydration plans, and then it always ends up, how do I integrate that with nutrition? And there's so many different ways to skin that cat, that we decided to look at it from a real, what can we boil this down to make it as simple as possible? And we started to analyze the intake of athletes that we're working with, and we go, right, well, when you really break this down, there's three things. When you do an endurance activity, there's three acute costs of that activity to the body. You've got the calories that you burn, mainly in the form of glycogen, carbohydrate. You've got the fluid that you lose in your sweat, and if it goes on for a significant amount of time, you've got the salt or the sodium you lose in your sweat. So those three levers, we call them, you need to pull those three levers to the right magnitude for you to replace a proportion of what you're losing. Because when you start exercising, if you do it right, your glycogen levels are topped up, your fluid levels are topped up, your salt levels are topped up, and we can accept a level of drop in those. And then what it all boils down to is getting those three levels right for you as an individual. And the carbohydrate one is probably actually the most simple one to dial in, because we can give some pretty good guidance on what people should start with. And then it's just a case of tweaking it up and down based on your pace and stuff. But if you're doing stuff for, 2 hours, 1 to 2 hours, because below an hour, energy intake is sort of neither here nor there. But between 1 and 2 hours, 30 grams an hour is a good starting point for most people, which equates to like an energy gel or something like that, or an energy bar. It's just like one standard commercial sports nutrition product is probably going to get you in that ballpark. You go up to kind of like 2, 3, 4 hours, and maybe that goes up to more like 60 grams an hour. And that is an indication of the fact that beyond 2 hours, you kind of, if you don't take anything in, you will rip through the glycogen stores in your body. So then it becomes a bit more of like a 1 in, 1 out type game.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, if you're pretty fast and you're going for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours or whatever, like you're smashing it for an Ironman or something, we know from reports from athletes and from the science out there that as much as 90 or 100 grams of carbohydrate an hour can be beneficial if you can get it in and digest it. And the things that change those numbers, so if you use 30, 60, 90 as the basic starting points, then adjust them downwards if you're a little bit slower than average, if you're a little bit smaller than average, and adjust them upwards if you're a little bit bigger than average or you're moving a little bit faster. And I think once you've got those numbers dialed in, they're not going to change a ton, unless your fitness level changes dramatically or, some other unforeseen things. So then you've got your carbohydrate amount, and really they're not going to change a lot, hot to cold, altitude to sea level, whatever it is, your carbohydrate burn rate is relatively constant. There is some argument that in short activities in extreme heat, which you guys would come up against, like an Olympic distance triathlon in Memphis, maybe you might burn a bit more carbohydrate, so you might up your levels in that. But once you start getting into the longer distances, it's all much of a muchness. It's about how much you can absorb. Yeah. So then you've got that sort of pillar, you've got that lever locked in. Then you're looking at fluid and sodium. And of course, they're all over the map because of individual differences and because of environmental conditions. So, you might on a cold day be 400 milliliters of fluid an hour. It might be that low if it's super cold and you've not got a high sweat rate and you're doing a long event where it's not a massive energy output. You might be really low. It could be, though, like we talked about before, you're up at the kind of 1.2 liters per hour. If it's hot, humid, you're working hard, and it's about, calibrating where you sit on that scale. And then it's the same with the sodium. And I think the problem with fueling and hydration plans is that people get very caught up on different brands. They get very caught up on little spurious things like the latest and greatest thing. Not that I'm having a pop at them, but like the Morton thing of like, slow release, and now we've got cluster dextrin, and we've got all these other things that are coming. So people love to like talk about the minutiae and the all of the detail, but what they don't know is how many grams of carb do I need an hour, how many milliliters of fluid, and how many milligrams of sodium. Because if you get those three things roughly right, like we're talking about right at the start, the body will just go, great, know what to do with that, and perform. So if you can hit those three levers, and we've just put a blog about this on our website, so if people want to get the numbers and things, they can just hit the Precision Hydration website and look in the blog for the fundamentals of endurance nutrition. And it's just like, what I love to do now is, if we talk to an athlete, the first challenge for them is like, okay, well, tell me how many grams of carb do you normally take an hour? How many mils of fluid? How many milligrams of sodium? Because if you don't know that stuff, we got to go and find out, basically.
Yeah. Well, we just had one of the latest people I did a sweat test on, who got done with a ride, and it was like a death march. He said, last 2 hours of his ride was horrible. One of the first hot days we had about a month ago, and we ended up doing the sweat sodium test on him. Ended up putting him on the pH 1500 tabs for his very next long ride. And he had gone where he didn't ride for 4 days because he felt so horrible after that hot day. And I got a text when he was done with his ride that following Saturday, after dialing in the amount of fluid a little better, and especially getting what was in his drink correct. And he was like, this is amazing. And I didn't realize I could get done with a ride tired, but not feeling like I wanted to die. Like, where I need to lay on the couch, or like, just in such a horrible state. He's like, I'm so excited for the rest of the summer, because I know I haven't felt like this after a ride before.
Yeah, you're right. Endurance athletes are tough. Generally we put up with a lot. And so people put up with feeling like absolute crap after some of these sessions, because you're not getting your carbohydrates, your fluids, or your salts right. Like, and I'm not saying you won't ever feel tired after a ride or beat up after a race, but once you've felt the difference of kind of getting those things right, there's kind of a difference between that nice fatigue, tiredness of having done some good hard work, versus where you've just depleted and battered your body. Exactly. And you've got to give it 4 days, as you said, to get over it. That's a different thing.
Go into, like, we did have a question about post rehydration, and how this person, one of our athletes, Cliff, he says he feels like so much better if he does basically a preload or a post rehydration with the 1500 right after the ride. We've often called it like the honeydew guarantee. So like, you get done, you take it, you rehydrate much quicker, and then you have energy to get the list done for the rest of the day and get your brownie points, and versus laying on the couch.
Yeah. Well, I chatted to someone about this yesterday, and it was we described it. If I go out for my long run on a Saturday, typically at the moment, it's not super long. It's like 90 minutes or something. I make sure I mix up a bottle of pH 1500 in the fridge before I go, so that there's no thinking about it when I get back. I get back, I drink that, and honestly, you'll know the feeling, Dale, from being someone who loses a lot of salt and stuff. The difference is that energy for the rest of the day to feel like I'm recovering properly. Because if you let it linger and you don't really I'll have a glass of water and then some food later, and then your energy level just declines, your recovery is so much compromised. And that's because it's proven, that extra sodium pulls the fluid into your bloodstream. It gets your blood volume back up again. You don't have those lightheaded, dizzy feelings and that sort of thing. It is a no-brainer, and you just need to basically get in the habit of it to feel the difference.
And it makes all the difference in the world if you actually plan on doing another session either the same day, or you get done in that late afternoon, and you're going to end up waking up early and doing a early morning session. If you're going to do another training session inside that 12 to, even 18-hour window, like, you've got to make sure that when you finish, especially a long, hot session, to rehydrate and prepare for the next one. You're not going to get it all back in that preload, that 60 to 90 minutes before. You're not going to get it all back that quickly. So making sure that you do get done with the session and immediately start the rehydration process is as much as preloading is a game changer, that is also a game changer.
Yeah, and the temptation then is, if you're not prepared, is just to smash a load of water. And then what happens is you end up, after a while, that is when you just end up running to the bathroom because you've already depleted your body of sodium. You're just diluting it further, and it won't thank you for that. So yes, it is a really important point.
Yeah, awesome. You got anything else, Funston?
No, I think that nails pretty much.
Yeah, I think that was pretty informative. A lot of really good information there. A lot of actionable stuff. Man, Andy, we appreciate your time, man.
I'm just sorry.
Remind
Sorry, I
everyone again
can't
where
be
they can
there on
find
the
you.
couch with you fellas.
Hey, things will calm down. You'll be back. Be back in no time.
Well,
Everyone,
I can't wait to
do
experience
yourself
the humidity.
Do yourself a favor and go to precisionhydration.com. There's a place to sign up for your newsletter, right, on the site?
Yeah.
They have a ton of good content that they put out.
Possibly the most informative newsletter in endurance performance and sport performance in general, out there. So everyone hates spam, but this is by no means spam email.
Yeah, your guys' stuff is like the one that I always read, as opposed to a lot of newsletters I get that just go straight to the trash. So
delete.
I'm always looking to see what kind of cool little gift thing you guys got going too. I like the one with the sweat out of the armpit the other day.
Yeah, that was a good one. Dave and the crew who put that newsletter together with us are A game. They bring their A game every week.
Yeah, they're good. They're good for sure. All right, Andy, we appreciate you, man.
Yeah, man.
Always good chatting with you.
We appreciate.
Good to see you, fellas.
We appreciate everyone hanging out, listening, watching. We'll catch you guys next time. Adios.
Peace.